Hello, everyone. Thanks for being with us and welcome to this online panel, Turkey's Elections, Local and Global Implications. I'm Mimi Kirk, Program Manager for the MESA Global Academy, an initiative of the Middle East Studies Association and the City University of New York Graduate Center that supports displaced scholars from the Middle East and North Africa who are currently in North America. This panel is co-hosted by the MESA Global Academy and the Arab Studies Institute, and Professor Asli Bali of Yale Law School will serve as moderator. Professor Bali is also chair of the Global Academy Committee and is president-elect of the Middle East Studies Association. So Asla, you have the floor. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Mimi, and welcome to our panel. As I think many of you know, on May 14th, we had Turkish national elections, and observers inside and outside of the country expected this election to show a decrease in electoral support for the party that has governed the country since 2002 and its leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. In the election, Turkish civil society proved again its deep commitment to democracy, with turnout levels in some parts of the country exceeding 90%, and on average across the country and in the diaspora, as much as 88% of eligible voters participated in these elections. And for the first time, they resulted in a presidential runoff because Erdogan was not able to garner enough support to earn a majority in the first round, and his party did indeed lose some of its vote share. So notwithstanding their incumbency advantage and, of course, the authoritarian practices for which both the party and their president have become known, they were not able to secure a resounding victory. And yet both the AKP and Erdogan performed better than had been expected by observers, which has led to a wide spectrum of analysis in the run-up to the runoff election, which will be taking place this Sunday on May 28th. We have assembled a fantastic panel of scholars to analyze from different perspectives how best to interpret the election results to date, what to expect this weekend, and what the 2023 national elections mean for the coming period in Turkey. I will now introduce our panelists in the order in which they will be presenting. I'm going to keep the introductions brief because I'm mindful that we have 6 distinguished presenters on our panel and only 90 minutes. Our first panelist will be Bengi Gumrukcu, who's a lecturer in the Department of Political Science at Rutgers University. Before joining the department in this capacity, she was a postdoc at the Center for European Studies at Rutgers, and prior to that served as an assistant professor at Izmir University and as a researcher at Izmir University of Economics. She earned her PhD from the University of Zurich, and during and after her doctoral studies held visiting positions at Bielefeld University, Sciences Po Paris, University of Paris 8, European University Institute, amongst others. Her research interests include social movements, political parties, democratization, political violence, the interplay of populism with protests and global political parties. She is currently finalizing a manuscript titled Protests and Politics in Turkey in the 1970s, The Making of a Protest Wave for Routledge. Our second panelist will be Halil Ibrahim Yenigun, who is a visiting professor at the University of Virginia and a MESA Global Academy Fellow. He received his PhD from the University of Virginia's Political Theory program, and he has worked as a postdoctoral scholar at the Transregional Studies Forum in Berlin and at Stanford University's Abbasi program in Islamic Studies. He has also held teaching positions at Stanford, Berkeley, and San Jose State Universities. His research is on Muslim political thought, Islamism, and Turkish democracy. Our third presenter will be Utku Balaban, who is a sociologist who specializes in urban, political, and economic sociology. He taught at Ankara University in Turkey until he was expelled and blacklisted by the government in 2017 for signing a statement known as the Peace Petition to protest deadly violence by government forces against Kurdish civilians in 2015. He is currently an associate professor of sociology in the Department of Race, Intersectionality, Gender, and Sociology at Xavier College. Our fourth panelist is Evren Altinkas, an adjunct professor in the Department of History at the University of Guelph, who also serves as a part-time lecturer at Wilfrid Laurier University and University of Trent. He has previously served as an assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Guelph, and his research areas are the history of the Middle East politics, Turkish history, intellectual history, and the transformation from the Ottoman Empire to a modern Middle East and the Turkish Republic. Our fifth panelist is Nazan Bedirhanoglu, who is an assistant professor in the sociology program at Xavier University. Her research interests focus on the shifting structures of the global political economy and the repercussions of these transformations for the Middle East in general, and more specifically for the Kurdish regions and Turkey in particular. And our final panelist will be Nihat Celik, who is a lecturer at the School of Public Affairs at San Diego State University. He received his PhD from Kadir Has University in 2015 with a dissertation entitled The Intentions and Capabilities of Turkey as a Regional Power, a Structuralist Realist Analysis. His research focuses on Turkish politics, diplomatic history, foreign policy analysis, and civil society, and his publications have appeared in numerous peer-reviewed journals. These were very brief introductions, and I apologize for the fact that I have the truncated bios of these distinguished panelists, but in the interest of time, I do want to turn the floor over to our panelists. Again, each has 5 minutes to make an opening presentation. We will then go through one round of moderated questions before turning to audience Q&A and a broader discussion. Professor Gumrukcu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Asli Jam. Thank you, Mimi, for organizing this, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I will try to, briefly set the ground for my other colleagues who are going to be taking up different aspects of the elections in Turkish politics these days. So, as you might know, this year also marks the centennial of the Republic. So this is also one of the reasons why these elections are symbolically important. And from a political perspective, we know that, in the last at least 10 years, Turkey's democracy has been defined as a competitive authoritarian regime. The regime in Turkey has been defined this way. And one aspect of this is that the playing field for the incumbents and the opposition is not an equal one. So when we look at the elections, we are seeing that both domestic and international observers have underlined that the elections might be, at least free, but they are unfair. And today we are seeing a lot of question marks around the free aspect as well. So I think, when we are discussing the electoral outcomes, from about 2 weeks ago, one thing that we are failing to, maybe underline is this this context, which we are seeing shaped by the electoral engineering maneuvers by the incumbents as well. Because when we look at the elections, we are seeing that they are actually held earlier than they were originally scheduled for. And this decision was taken by the president himself. The elections were normally planned for June 18th originally, but we are seeing, conditions like the seasonal conditions, the Hajj time, the summer break of the schools were taken into consideration. Yeah, so the opposition, wanted to have an early election before April 6th to get rid of the negative impacts of the new law that was introduced last year. Another thing to underline maybe that, according to several constitutional law scholars, Erdogan running in this election itself is kind of, unconstitutional. And we know that the main opposition party, CHP, appealed to this, to the Supreme Election Board, and they kind of declined their appeal. The main, issues the elections are shaped around are especially, economy. The country is going through, significantly bad economic conditions. But despite this, we are seeing that, voters did not vote Erdogan out. And I'm sure, some of my colleagues are going to be talking about it later on. We can also talk about the earthquake impact. As you might know, the region, Turkey and, some parts of Syria were impacted from two significant earthquakes in February, and we can discuss, the role of the earthquakes, because when we look at the polls from the time before the earthquake, we are seeing that most of them were favoring Erdogan. But after that, especially, a few months after the earthquake, we started to see some mixed results from the polls. On the other hand, we also see that, from the incumbents' perspective, these elections were about the beka of the state, the survival of the state, and they kind of underlined security issues and terrorism, and in their campaign as well, they kind of underlined that this is the century of Turkey. That was their motto, and they highlighted the military industrial complex sort of that they kind of built in the last years, mentioning the statecraft, the natural gas that was founded, the first helicopter that is Turkish made. And they also kind of, use the more negative campaigning rhetoric, including, divisive rhetoric targeting the minorities in the in the country. For the opposition, I can say that it was kind of like a more democracy versus authoritarianism kind of, like pledge. They came together as a large coalition, probably, like the widest coalition of opposition the country has seen, making a pledge to turn back to the parliamentary system in the country instead of the existing presidential one. And the initial campaign of the opposition candidate, Kılıçdaroğlu, has been a more positive campaign, which he, like built around this rhetoric of helalleşme, kind of, like making peace with the groups which the old CHP, so to speak, kind of, like offended. He, like published social media videos about the Kurds, about Alevis in the country. They kind of highlighted, like hope versus fear. But we are seeing that after the first round of elections, maybe with the surprising, like vote share, Sinan Oğan, a nationalist candidate, is also turned into a negative campaign, which might lead to an increased, like nationalism in the upcoming days. Thank you.
And now I turn the floor to Professor Yenigun.
Okay. Thank you so much, Asli, for this generous introduction, and also Mimi for organizing this event. And I thank also MESA Global Academy. So I will take on some points from Selin. The fact that the elections are, in my opinion, neither free nor fair. They are not free because first, Ekrem İmamoğlu was never allowed to run because of the hanging court case. And second, Erdogan's rival, Demirtas, has been in jail since 2016. And this point is important because I want to raise an issue about that. It can never be emphasized enough that Turkey's elections are neither free nor fair. And the other thing, Turkey is not a democracy anymore. This is what Varieties of Democracy, Economist Index, and World Justice Project and Freedom House, they all agree that Turkey is either an electoral autocracy or a competitive authoritarian regime. But we are facing with a dilemma under such regimes, and this is what I want to raise. So the opposition has been giving the impression that they could win. They could not win, although Erdogan also did not win either. And Erdogan's party, AKP, does not maintain a majority in the parliament. They are 268 in the parliament. It still doesn't change the fact that the elections are held under a non-democratic regime. It is so. What is the basic dilemma under this regime is so the opposition has to give the impression that they could win the elections, and they campaign for that. And why they campaign for that? Because otherwise, if they don't keep on the facade of democracy competitive regime, then many voters on the opposition could just give up voting, and political apathy might result from that. But the fact that if they continue to do that, and if the elections are not winnable, then that brings the other issue that then the regime will maintain mandate and electoral legitimacy, and they will continue to say that Erdogan is a freely elected democratic leader, and you just have to shut up about his abuse of power. So that is an important dilemma, and the fact that if they just stop, if everybody stops about the facade, and then they say we are not a democracy, let's not talk about that, and then we cannot win the elections, then the political apathy in the border space will result in a total consolidation of autocratic regime. So that is the issue, and I want to connect it to an interesting aspect of these elections, and this is the never seen before enthusiasm by the diasporic Muslims about Turkish elections. So this is an interesting thing because back in the day, this wasn't very common. I can remember right after 2015 November elections, and actually those elections, I would say, is the first unfair elections in the line of elections, and that one had some pundits responding to those elections as so Erdogan is the I remember a piece from Sümeyye Gamnuşi, who is also Rashid Al Gamnuşi's daughter. So she wrote a piece on Huffington Post saying Erdogan, Sisi, and Western hypocrisy. So basically, there is a Western hypocrisy. They are not doing anything about Sisi. They are fine with that. But when it comes to Erdogan, they start talking about authoritarianism. So the worst form of whataboutism was expressed at the time, but it changed this time. What happened is we have seen many more pundits and commentators talking about Turkey and Erdogan as the leader of a democratic country, and the opposition as being anti-Muslim. An interesting case in point is the May 11th declaration by 50 ulema around the Muslim world, and they said that Erdogan has benefited Muslims, has brought about benefits to Muslims, and the other side is anti-Islam and is going to reverse the gains of Muslims. And Yasir Qadhi, a famous pundit and Islamic scholar, on Twitter took this opportunity and said that so one side is definitely anti-Islam, the opposition is anti-Islam, and we have to choose the lesser of two evils, and Erdogan is the lesser of two evils. Not just that, even after the elections on May 16, Asad Samhanna on Newsweek made a similar contribution and said actually about democracy, stop calling Erdogan a dictator. Dictators don't run off, don't go to runoffs. So you could see two lines of thinking. One is one is about Erdogan is a democratic leader, so which gains actually legitimacy from this facade of elections, free and fair elections. So that's why the fact that elections are neither free nor fair and it is under non-democracy has always has to be emphasized. But the other point that is important about this discourse, this new discourse, is that both the social media commentators or these analysts or these pundits, what they always emphasize is Turkey, not just like about the democratic part, but Turkey is now a rising power. Turkey is now emerging as a Muslim power against liberal universalism. And this is, in my opinion, a direct outcome of Turkey's soft power initiatives that we have seen over the last several years.
Halil, just one more minute.
Okay. But what I want to emphasize when we look at this discourse is the fact that back in the day, after 9/11, when there was an emerging liberal Islam discourse, they would propose democracies like Turkey as a model of Muslim democracy, where you could see ethical principles of democracy realized under those regimes, like freedoms and consultative government, etc. But after this new wave of Muslim power, like this new discourse about liberal universalism, what we see is a discourse that is based on decolonization and post-coloniality, and it emphasizes Muslim liberation from liberal universalism. And if you dig deeper with this discourse, what you find out is that this Muslim power is always defined based on Muslim interests, self-interest or group interests of Muslims, as opposed to any ethical principles. So I wanted to raise attention to that fact, that shift in discourse and shift in the value that, you know, the value is now Muslim power as opposed to Muslim ethical principles based on democracy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Professor Balaban.
Thank you, Mimi. Thank you, Asli. Thank you for this opportunity. So I'll just keep this as short as possible. First of all, let me underline one simple fact as strong as possible. Most of the predictions about this elections were proven wrong. Opinion makers, both in Turkey and abroad, basically, and as well as the opposition, expected Kılıçdaroğlu to have a higher voting share than Erdogan. But this did not happen. That's why we need to take another look at what the Islamists under Erdogan and the opposition under Kılıçdaroğlu did before the election. We need to just revisit, revisit their general strategy. I believe most observers miss the main factor behind Erdogan's surprising performance in this election. Many nowadays refer to the irregularities in the election process. Similarly, it's obvious that Erdogan boosted the racist rhetoric against the Kurds, as well as the incarceration of thousands of Kurdish activists. We should not overlook these factors. However, one question still lingers. How come was Erdogan able to receive over 40% of the votes, despite the years-long political repression and decline in wages? Now, let me quickly move to what I think about Erdogan's strategy. I believe the answer to this question about how Erdogan outperformed expectations is related to his economic policy, which many observers and opinion makers ironically saw as a factor that would bring his demise in this election. And that particular policy was to keep the interest rates low. Opinion makers did not understand the logic behind Erdogan's strategy. He was called delusional and ignorant. However, Erdogan had a clear political goal with this particular economic policy, and I call his strategy sustainable decline. According to this, or his sustainable decline strategy, Erdogan, since 2015, has let the Turkish currency deteriorate, basically go down, and kept the interest rates down to further depreciate the Turkish lira since 2019. On the one hand, this policy brought the wages down. Thus, observers believe that Erdogan would lose the next election. On the other hand, the same policy has also boosted the employment since 2019. As a matter of fact, since 2019, basically we just have observed a surge in the number of jobs. I mean, the surge is so big that we haven't seen anything like it, for the last decade. And let me move to come to Kılıçdaroğlu's or the opposition strategy. The opposition strategy was to establish an election alliance that would represent all political ideologies under one umbrella, and to expect the decline in wages, push the working class to the ballot box on their behalf. Because, I mean, basically the strategy did not have any kind of appeal for the working class. In other words, the opposition did not offer any kind of positive message, substantial and positive message for the working class. Basically, the working class did not respond, to the opposition's call, because they were not offered an alternative. Workers chose employment over wage increases or democratic participation. This was, I believe, the main reason behind the election result. And within my last minute, let me just come to the lessons, if you will, about these elections. I believe after the election, regardless of the results, within the next few days, the opposition should revisit its policy and focus on a more left-oriented narrative, taking the working class seriously, and developing, let's say, policies that would directly, let's say, give some sort of let's say, voice to the working class concerns and demand, to just take part in the democratic process. And last but not least, some people argue that if Erdogan wins, he may adopt some sort of a more liberal approach after the election. Except for the Kurds, I think this is a possibility. Because at this point, Erdogan now this sort of works to just leave a positive legacy for himself, unfortunately. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Professor Altinkas.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I need to say that after listening to Utku, I have a slight comment to start with. We always base our assumptions on the very premises that the elections were held fairly and there were no corruptions, but that's just something we need to keep in mind when it comes to evaluate or assess the results of the election regarding Erdogan's party receiving the highest number of votes. But my talk today is going to be around the refugees in Turkey, because after evaluating the statements of the candidates, especially the candidate of opposition, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, since the beginning of last week, and given the fact that Kılıçdaroğlu has made a press statement with Ümit Özdağ, the leader of Zafer Partisi, the political party that is based only around the idea of sending the refugees back to their home, I believe the elections on Sunday will not be a political one, but more like a referendum about the refugee problem, given the videos, tweets, and other kinds of statements from both parties since the beginning of last week. Again, I started to see in the public opinion of Turkey that the people who refrained going to vote in the first round of elections, as you said in the beginning, it's 88% of the voters, and there are approximately 8 million people who did not vote. There was a recent poll that was conducted on Tuesday and yesterday, and the results were sent to me because I subscribe to one of those poll companies. The poll was about the reason why the people did not go to vote and whether they will go and vote in the second round. And the result was very interesting. Out of the more than 5,000 people who said they didn't vote in the first round, say 70% of them said that they will go and vote because they started to consider the second round as the continuity of the refugee policies, and they believe that refugee issue is a huge problem in Turkey. So the polls that I have recently found out, which is published in April 2023 by Metropol, says that 82% of Turkish population believes that refugees must return to their home countries, whereas 75% of them believe that refugees are a burden for the Turkish economy, and 72% of them believe that refugees are a security problem for Turkey. So based on these poll results and based on the policy, or let's say the campaign that is being followed by Kılıçdaroğlu and Özdağ, especially since yesterday, because that's the day they declared their collaboration, I believe the Sunday election will be a referendum again for the refugees, and I am not so sure about the result of the elections regarding Erdogan's win based on this reactionary potential votes that will appear on Sunday. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And Professor Bedirhanoglu, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Asli and Mimi. Thank you so much for organizing this panel. I'd like to make 3 brief arguments about the importance of the Kurdish votes to be followed by what I think is waiting for Kurds if Erdogan is re-elected. First, Kurds continue to be central to this election, especially during this period between the 2 elections. The opposition alliance tried to garner nationalist votes, thinking that the third candidate, Sinan Oğan, who received 5% of the votes, is the kingmaker. This is a flawed or outright wrong strategy that will disenfranchise Kurdish votes. Disenfranchising Kurds is also the main strategy of Erdogan. He's trying to keep Kurds away from the ballot boxes by emphasizing the nationalist narrative of the opposition. If Kurds do not go to the polls, Erdogan will not only have a victory, but a landslide victory that will push Turkey to a darker period. Today, the Kurdish movement once again declared their support for the opposition leader Kılıçdaroğlu, inviting their electoral base to vote, because that's the fear on their side too. Right now, unfortunately, the prevailing narrative focuses on the xenophobic Turkish nationalist votes for the presidential runoff. Second, we should note the unfairness of the playing field given the immense pressure brought to bear on Kurdish politicians and activists, as shown by the mass arrests of the Kurdish activists between the two elections. Kurds and also some Turkish socialists continue to organize despite the intimidation and the fact that public space is not available to them. There are also some evidence of systematic fraud in the elections, as mentioned, but we cannot know the scale. However, the obstacle Kurds face on a daily basis is obvious, not to mention the thousands of political prisoners in the country. This is not even comparable to the other political groups in Turkey in terms of the pressure they face. Kurds are trying to defeat the algorithm, both in the virtual and in physical worlds. Had there been a level playing field for Kurds, I think Erdogan would have lost in the first round. Third, I think there's another point that shows how crucial Kurdish region is. The mechanism that proved to be successful in eliminating and oppressing the Kurdish movement are expanded to the whole country now. The failure of the Kurdish peace process, the ensuing violence, the implementation of emergency rules in Kurdish cities, these all constitute a laboratory of securitization through which a repertoire of oppression was developed. And this laboratory is the testing ground for the founding elements of the authoritarian drift in the country. So we are now all facing what the Kurdish cities had to go through over the last couple of decades. So taking all these points into consideration, all in all, I think Kurds are focused on unseating Erdogan in this election cycle. An opposition leader is the lesser of two evils for the Kurds. No matter the result of elections, the Kurdish struggle will continue because it's now for survival, right? And Kurdish movement doesn't get its power from the ballot box. It's a people's movement that has unprecedented mobilization power. So regardless of the outcome this Sunday, I think this will be a wake-up call, another wake-up call for the Kurdish political movement, and I hope for the rest of the opposition, because despite the unconditional support the Kurdish movement has from its base, its leadership, I believe, will reconsider coming up with new ground-up strategies, and because it operates like below its potential right now. And I'm saying this with all due respect to relentless activists on the ground, on the field, and political prisoners, and those who lost their lives, or who were murdered in this struggle. So overall, like a main problem is, with the exception of Kurdish political organizations, Turkey's political scene is fixated on election cycles, and the field of politics is reduced to electoral behavior. And I think for the opposition in general, this only legitimizes the non-democratic establishment. So what Kurds have been doing for the last couple of decades could also be a role model for the rest of the country, but Kurds also will reconsider, and then I hope will come up with new ground-up strategies. So I'll just stop here, and then we can move on to the next panelist, I think. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Professor Celik, last but not least, and I know you're going to share your screen.
Thanks a lot, Asli and Mimi, for organizing this event. I will talk about the processes of securitization and symbolism in the elections. For this reason, I will use a PowerPoint. So religious symbols and the emphasis on the survival of the nation, which is Beka, have played a great role in the election campaign process. Despite the economic decline, as you can see here, the currency shock and increasing inflation rate, people are wondering why the AKP did not lose as much vote as expected. So people are actually now questioning the validity of the saucepan theory, which is associated with former Prime Minister and President Süleyman Demirel. However, in order to understand the outcome, why the economic downturn did not affect the AKP in a negative manner as much as expected, we must look at the processes of securitization. For example, this is a recent poll published by Metropol, Turkey's Pulse, conducted in April, and with 2,000 participants. When asked, the participants blamed different actors for their current economic problems. And the important thing is that 49% of the AKP voters believed that the current economic problems were because of the intervention of foreign powers or foreign actors. Also, we see that in nationalist action parties, voter base 47%. So this mindset, which is produced by the AKP and used often in its mouthpiece media, has been propagated relentlessly. And symbols, religious symbols also played a great role. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, the leader of the opposition and the candidate, visited the house, and unknowingly he stepped on a prayer rug, which should have been removed there after the prayers ended. So this has been presented as a great attack on Islam and Islamic values and the society. And some journalists and newspapers associated the main opposition as an enemy of the religion and religious values. And interestingly, this policy, this discourse has a bias. For example, in a street interview, one of the ladies interviewed stated that if the JP comes to power, it will close down all the mosques in the country. So these sort of fears play to the hands of the AKP. And in addition, as the election campaigns are always, uneven for opposition parties in competitive authoritarian regimes, there was a liberal campaign against the main opposition. There were lots of billboards and posters all over the country in various cities, as if they were the official posters of the opposition. And Erdogan used this policy well, and the opposition was associated with crisis and chaos. And last but not least, Erdogan used a video, actually the campaign song and clip of the opposition, and this video was doctored, and Murat Karayilan was added to this video as if the PKK is supporting the opposition and its candidate. And just a few days ago, Erdogan was asked about this video. He showed to the public that it was false, it was fake. He said, yes, but what difference does it make? So along these fears and policies of securitization, the election campaign of the JDP focused on the survival of the country, and that's why their campaign slogan, Turkey is entrusted to you. So now it's your duty to vote for the AKP. And for the second round, for the runoff elections, the same policy continues, because the pro-government media, for example, in different newspapers, you can see the same thing. They publish that in prisons where people are in for supporting terrorist organizations, they voted for the opposition's candidate, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. And it will be an interesting thing to watch the elections on Sunday. But the same liberal campaign and negative campaigning continues. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. All of our panelists have been incredibly diligent in keeping to time. So thank you so much for that. And we have some time for a first round of questions amongst us. And I'm really, I'm interested in drawing on your respective presentations to ask two kinds of questions. So what we've heard from you, I think globally, is that we've seen some scripts that are both familiar and also presented in a novel way that we might not have expected. So There's certainly the weaponization of racism and nationalism, which is evident in the closing remarks that Nihat just provided to us, the framing of the Kurdish vote as a terrorist vote, the Kurdish electorate as terrorists, the opposition as smeared with terrorism, but also the present self-presentation of both sides as actually inheritors of a national mantle. The anti-refugee language is another part of this kind of weaponized racism that I'm pointing to as part of the broader rise of nationalism that many of you touched upon. There was also, interestingly, the weaponization of misogyny, in the sense of anti-women campaigns of traditional values, so pulling out of the Istanbul Convention, anti-LGBTQ. I mean, these are, it just seems like a kind of culture war use of identity politics to mobilize. And that this can also be framed as securitization in the way that Nihat did in his last presentation. There's also a really interesting account of how better to understand the economic policies here, instead of understanding Erdogan as a terrible mismanager of the economy who has produced economic crisis. We've been given this analysis from Professor Balaban that this was a brilliant use, in a sense, of this inflationary politics of full employment to, you know, even though it ends up meaning massive inflation and decline in real wages, the fact of maintaining full employment and supporting small and medium-sized enterprise is itself tactically a brilliant move. It may be strategically terrible for the economy as a whole, but very effective as an electoral strategy. And therefore, it's this very same economy, through a different looking glass, explains electoral performance, is one of the analyses that we received. And then we've had also an account of the diaspora as a new dimension that we need to think about, of a kind of mobilized Muslim electorate from outside. And there are actually competing diasporas, because of course there's also the fact that diasporas in the North America, in the, you know, sort of broad Anglo world, UK, Ireland, et cetera, were voting overwhelmingly for the opposition. And so there's a whole new dimension to think about of how this plays out. So one question I would ask is, how in this period, that this kind of interlude period that we're in, do we assess the first round as a space where we can think in different terms about the implications of what I think is still, and this is Professor Yenigun's presentation, but I would invite you to come back and critique what I'm about to say, which is that we're in a competitive authoritarian environment. I think in my opening, I said Turkish civil society's commitment to democracy continues to be sort of performed through the massive turnout that we see even in an authoritarian context. But I think we would all agree that we don't see a democratic Turkey today by any stretch. But we do nonetheless see some version of competition. Otherwise, you wouldn't, the electorate isn't idiotic. They're not coming out to perform something that's merely a parody. They understand there to be consequences to their actions. And indeed, there's a massive get out the vote campaign taking place right now for the runoff on Sunday, notwithstanding broad disappointment amongst opposition and Kurdish electorate about the outcome that they got. So is there something we can say that's new about the practices of competitive authoritarianism, or authoritarianism in Turkey more generally, in now almost a quarter century of domination by the AKP? So for example, about the media landscape or the social media landscape, have we learned something new in this election? Is there a reason that anybody was or could be surprised, essentially? And I will admit myself that, having imagined myself to be completely a realist in observing the scene, and imagining that it is extremely difficult to expect any kind of an opposition, meaningful change in the political environment in Turkey, nonetheless, I experienced the visceral reality that I must have had hope or optimism of some kind, because of how crushed I felt by Sunday night and throughout Monday. And on the other hand, I and many others are continuing to mobilize for people to come out this Sunday to vote again. So is there something new that we can learn from this period? And then separately, if you're not interested in engaging that question, and many of you have engaged in one way or another in your opening remarks, but if you have some additional reflections you might have on that question. On the other hand, we are going to be in a different landscape come next Monday, of one kind or another. What are the calculations? Professor Bedirhanoglu has already suggested to us, and this is widely also debated already in all fora in Turkey in the political spectrum: introspection, reconsideration, return to first principles. What kinds of strategies do we imagine for the next 5 years that the various political streams that we've been talking about, whether it's from the perspective of those that are dealing with the refugee communities, whether we're talking about the Kurdish electorate and the lessons to be drawn for that electorate from this election, and whether or not there's a good reason why the Kurdish electorate might feel alienated, notwithstanding the calculus that Professor Bedirhanoglu described of voting for the opposition is obviously the strategy that they will nonetheless embrace, despite the fact that the opposition is engaging in alliance activities with parties that are deeply anti-Kurdish and continuing a nationalist rhetoric. So what should we expect from the political spectrum for the next 5 years? And indeed, I think one possible avenue to explore, particularly Professor Yenigun, given your analysis, is whether anyone could still plausibly say after Monday that we will have a competitive authoritarian future, or are we now resigned to a different environment in which even the modest optimism of pre-May 14th is eclipsed? So with that, I turn the floor back to you, and let's go in reverse order. So Professor Celik, you go first.
Well, thank you. It depends on the AKP's actions after Sunday and, of course, the election results. The economic downturn may increase, and this may also lead, an increasing pressure on the opposition and the opposition media outlets, and, of course, the social media. We can see crackdowns. However, I must say that the refugee issue is playing a great role in these elections, as my colleague Evren mentioned, and we can see some change in Erdogan's attitude. For example, last week, Süleyman Soylu commented that we can never send them back or God will punish us. But just 2 days ago, Erdogan commented that we are now building homes in northern Syria and we will move them in about 1 year to northern parts of Syria and resettle them there. So probably they saw the public opinion surveys and they are changing their attitude. The other thing is that there's a high level of mobilization in the Turkish society, which we could see in the Gezi protests first, and later on 2019 local elections, and the tastes of winning in Istanbul and Ankara certainly consolidated the opposition. And we can see this mobilization now in the campaigns for getting to vote and also volunteer observers during the elections. So it will be an interesting election to watch, and still I think it will be a close race. Both sides will go out vote at their maximum. But I must add another thing very briefly. It is when it comes to Kurdish vote, we can say it is the JDP is leading a conservative alliance. So most Kurds, conservative Kurds, voted for the JDP or its ally Hüdapar, which is actually associated with Hizbullah, Turkish Hizbullah, and Hüdapar actually means the same, God's party, we can translate it. So the Kurdish vote is also divided, just like Turkish conservatives, Kurdish conservatives also vote for the AKP. So it is a different alliance, including nationalist parties like the Nationalist Action Party and Sinan Oğan now. And also we have ultra conservative Hüdapar. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm just going to interject for a second before we continue, because I know we're short on time in general. So I'm going to say if our panelists can keep their answers in this first round to 2 or 3 minutes. And I'm going to add a question now, because we've had at least one question from the audience that I think might usefully be engaged at this point in these remarks, which is there anything that can be done given that Erdogan can count on 40-something% of the vote election after election, which I think has been proven once again that there is a block of durable AKP voters. Is there anything, policy, candidate, strategy, et cetera, that might be able to co-opt some portion of this voter base? And this is a going forward question. So it's a gloss on my question of how might the political spectrum be reshuffled? And maybe I might add one more addendum to my own earlier question about the political spectrum. One of the opposition alliance strategies has been to be transpartisan. That is to include in the opposition alliance right-wing parties or conservative parties. And now the result has been an even more supercharged conservative parliament. How does this shake up so that we have, not only Hüdapar and Yeniden Refah and other deeply troubling far-right fascist parties in parliament now, thanks to the AKP's alliance, but we also have a number of quite far-right parties or center-right parties as a consequence of the opposition alliance decision to give MP positions on their list to small parties that would otherwise never have made it into parliament. So in what sense does this shake up the political spectrum? Just as a clarification of my earlier question. But okay, we continue, and Professor Bedirhanoglu. Again, we're going in reverse order.
Thank you so much, Asli. I would like to comment on Nihat's final point before I move on to my answers. It's just, I think, of course, the Kurdish voter base is not homogeneous, but I think it's a bit of a overstatement to say like it's so divided that like all conservative Kurds like voted for Hüdapar. This is not proven evidence by the numbers or anything. So I don't think that applies to our case here. But one thing I would like to add is just like for what's next. We know that because of the economic situation, Erdogan also needs to gather, like if he's elected, I mean, in the second round, he needs to get support from the international markets. So we might even see a brief period of liberalization. I mean, it's not that evident, but we might even see like at least that is diminished to the struggle in terms of like rule of law and the struggle in the courts and other things. It's not gonna create any rose gardens or anything like that. I don't mean to say that, but like a brief period could even just follow to consolidate, his whatever vote he's gonna get. But the main problem is that, as I mentioned, is the reduction of all politics to election cycles. It's what gives us hope to, right? People don't go to election polls out of hope, but almost out of despair, because all other means of like political organization is obstructed in the country. You also mentioned that you were devastated after the first round, but I would like to invite all of us who had the right to vote how devastated we were in 2015 elections, 2017 referendum, 2018 elections. Like it's just like the 2 months prior to election, there is this like unfulfilled hope going on social media. It's like an echo chamber of like our own voices. It doesn't have any correspondence on the field in the voter base. So I think this like new means of organization needs to be taught, but the main opposition party, like my colleagues mentioned how mobilized, the opposition is, it's not. And the leadership is not, the opposition leadership doesn't want to take on this role either. Up until this last cycle of elections, I think the opposition leadership in Turkey was also very happy with the status quo. Right, like this is a nice game that like in every elections it looks competitive, it's authoritarianism, but they're like there's the competitive parties and then they're running up in the elections and everything. But I think this just creates like a big illusion. Sorry, this creates like a big illusion. I can just stop here. It's just thank you so much.
Okay. Professor Altinkas.
Yes, thank you. So before I begin, I have to correct something, because as far as I understood, my colleague Nihat said that the conservative votes from the Kurds went to JDP, the Erdogan's political party, not to Hüdapar, just to mention that before I begin. So one thing I need to mention in Turkish politics is that in Turkey, everything goes around identity politics. So when Kılıçdaroğlu stepped out as the opposition's candidate for the president, he clearly stated that he was an Alevite, he's Kurdish, and this has created a kind of reaction among the voters. So I think that's one of the reasons why Erdogan received so high level of votes in the first round, including AKP and other political parties in AKP's coalition. And I believe, given the fact that the coalition of opposition today is a very fragile one, if in the second round Erdogan wins the elections, the opposition leadership will definitely change. There are some other potential figures in Turkish opposition who are considered as, the potential leaders of Turkey in the future. One of them is Ekrem İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul, and the other one is Mansur Yavaş, the mayor of Ankara. These two gentlemen have completely different views about the politics. They have completely different views about the future of Turkey. Although they are under the banner of CHP or under the banner of, cooperating with Kılıçdaroğlu in this election, I believe right after the elections, if Kılıçdaroğlu loses, these two figures will become more prominent political leaders within the CHP or within the opposition. And by opposition, I'm not only mentioning CHP, but also İYİ Party, the other major partner of opposition. And there is an upcoming Congress of İYİ Party in the end of June, and there might be a surprise because we all know that Mansur Yavaş is ideologically affiliated with İYİ Party and Akşener. So that's one thing. One last thing before I stop is that something that really surprised me in these elections was the organization of a group called Türkiye Gönüllüleri. These are the people who organized in the local elections of 2019. And now in Canada, for instance, where I live, they worked very effectively in order to push people to vote for the elections. They carried out wonderful campaigns, and I think this group, it is not limited to foreign countries. They are also very active within Turkey, and I believe this kind of consciousness that is created among the youth through the use of these channels will also be signs of hope or beacons of hope for the future of Turkey. Thank you.
Professor Balaban, and I'm just going to try one more time to get that one question about, is there some way to erode Erdogan's base across? And again, note that the strategy the opposition pursued of pulling in center-right and right parties to the alliance apparently did not result in eroding that voter base, at least in this particular round for the parliament. We don't see an erosion that was occasioned by, the Future Party or Deva. So one question is, given your economic reading, is there some other strategy that might be pursued? How might one pursue eroding the durable base that the AKP enjoys amongst the electorate? But you can feel free to answer another question as well, but it just seemed you were especially well placed.
No, thank you very much, As. I mean, you had two broad questions. I think both of them are just, are really to the point. Just, a brief, very quick, introduction. If the identity politics is or were the main factor behind this election result, basically, then we should just remind ourselves that Kılıçdaroğlu, the leader of the opposition right now, has done his best since 2010 for the last 13 years to break the game of the right-wing political actors who just worked on the identity politics, like curse, nationalism, misogynism, all sorts of different things. So if this is the problem, basically Kılıçdaroğlu has offered a solution for it. This alliance politics basically just has been an answer to it. So, and it did not work within the last, let's say 13 years. It did not work, within this election. So that if this is this kind of a problem, we can never ever overcome with any kind of strategy such as Kılıçdaroğlu's, which I would admire actually, like at that level. Then why do you have elections in the first place? Then we are talking about the problem basically which has no solution in the first place. So that's why even though, again, to repeat myself, I believe we should not overlook all these factors, this misogynism, chauvinism, racism. I don't think, these factors, are enough for us to explain why Erdogan still, keeps getting this over 40% of the votes. No one, as far as I see, argues that, let's say, Erdogan just won less than, for instance, 40%, even those who refer to these irregularities in the elections. Now, competitive authoritarianism, your first question. I think both sides, both election alliances were and are makers of the competitive authoritarianism. So that's why I believe also competitive authoritarianism is not that much of a useful concept here. I mean, the opposition also basically contributed to the very making of this competitive authoritarianism, for the last, let's say again, in 13 years. The Kurdish question is a case in point, as Dr. Bedirhanoglu pointed out. basically the opposition contributed, like to the disenfranchisement of the Kurds within the last decade. The alliance politics collapsed. This is the main lesson I think we should draw from this election result. The strategy was already weak from the perspective of the strongest actor on the opposition, the central-left CHP and its leader Kılıçdaroğlu. And here is why. If the opposition alliance wins tomorrow or in 2 days, CHP would or will contribute to the rightward shift of the political scene, even if it wins. If it loses, then we will see the most right-wing government for many decades. In other words, CHP's strategy, regardless of the election result, was almost designed to support the right-wing policies and politics in one way or another, which support racism, misogynism, and economic unjust policies for the working class. I know I exceeded my time, but let me come back to your second question about what is to be done, what kind of strategies for the next 5 years. Let me say something controversial. I do not think the actors whom we should criticize for the result of the first round are the political elites. Let me underline, also repeat the same sentence. The political elites are not the first ones to criticize for the election result. I was involved in party politics in the late 2010s. My experience there, in those years, convinced me time and again that the political elites basically respond to the demands of the most vocal supporters of their own political parties. And in the case of CHP, again, under the leadership of Kılıçdaroğlu, the strongest, one most vocal group was basically the secularist privileged liberals, or the petit bourgeoisie. I believe these groups are the first to criticize. The salaried middle class, privileged middle class, should have done much more than just mobilizing themselves just before the elections. They should have spent substantial resources to reach out to the working class. However, they adopted a narcissistic approach and patronized the working class. Accordingly, Kılıçdaroğlu basically followed their demands or their perspective. And I believe the last point after the election, the center-left CHP, again, should learn the lesson and just go and adopt a more left-oriented perspective after the election. Of course, as well as the socialists, but I'm not going to talk about them, in this round. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Yenigun.
Thank you so much. Actually, for Utku's remarks, I can just agree with most of them, but about the pessimism about the current situation, actually, I might have sounded very pessimistic, but actually I am not. I believe hope is what keeps the possibility of democracy alive in Turkey. And the fact that the opposition is still, against all odds, still mobilizing people, that keeps the hope alive. And oftentimes I make this remark, the opposition actually in Turkey, if they win, they will win not thanks to free and fair elections, but in spite of unfair and unfair elections. But they still can only change the regime with elections. And that's why they have to fight, while underlining the fact that elections are not fair nor fair. But about the shifts among the conservative right-wing voters, actually, I'm not, again, like that pessimistic when I am interpreting the results. If you actually look at the fact of the matter is CHP won constituency in many strongholds of AKP in the parliamentary elections. The presidential elections are a different matter, but if you look at the parliamentary elections, you'd find out AKP lost in general 7%, and also a lot of this seems to have gone to CHP based. In Malatya, Konya, Kayseri, I checked the results in many different strongholds, and that is the case. So I think they may have done something still, even if it's not enough, they may have done something useful, and there may be some other strategies coming up. For those strategies, I would agree with Utku with most of that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And Professor Gumrukcu, you're at the end of our round, but I want to note that there is a question to you specifically from the audience that I'm going to interpret slightly differently, which is not, just in thinking about what would it take to have a meaningful transition here, if first of all the runoff were to produce a defeat for Erdogan, what would we then expect in the political spectrum? But more generally, do we think, in fact, that, and this, of course, follows on the points that have been made by Professor Bedirhanoglu and Professor Balaban and now Professor Yenigun, given that the opposition itself is, for example, embracing this anti-refugee position, involves a coalition that has many center-right and far-right actors, etc. Would an opposition victory for presidency actually usher in any kind of meaningful change in what we can expect, particularly when it's limited to the presidency, given what we've seen with the parliamentary results?
Yeah. Thank you for these questions. I would like to briefly, mention maybe one thing that Asli, Jam, you were asking about, like the newness about this election cycle. Maybe it's not something, new, but I think that is very striking in this particular election run is the popular mobilization, as we can call it, right? I think, when we are referring to the opposition, we should also be careful about like which aspect of the opposition we are referring to, kind of taking into consideration how Leo Key Jr. kind of distinguished party in the electorate and party organization and party grassroots, right? Like I think during this election cycle, maybe thanks to also like the earthquake impact, after which people came together a lot, like to support each other in a more solidaristic way that we have been observing since the Gezi Park protests. I think it reached to a level of maybe not unprecedented, but a very high level of popular mobilization around, like getting people to the polls, like maintaining election integrity and, like protecting the votes and everything. So I think this is kind of like a very important point that we need to take into consideration. I think, like given what Erdogan has been saying about like the transfer of power and, like all these populist authoritarian leaders, they are kind of underlining the importance of the national will. I think if if depending on the outcome of the Sunday's polls, right, like depending on the margin between the opposition and the incumbents, if there is a significant, like win for the opposition, I wouldn't expect any, like significant pushback from the incumbents. But if there's like a slight margin of difference between the votes, we can see some, like maybe electoral maneuvering, as they have done in the Istanbul local elections back in 2019, maybe, like to call for repeat elections or, like recounting of the elections, as we have seen last almost two Sundays ago, like how they objected some election results at some particular ballot boxes. So we can expect some sort of a pushback in that regard, but eventually, given how Erdogan, like has been underlining national will and the importance of the ballot boxes, and how, like recently, I think maybe today or yesterday, he was underlining that he's not a dictator and this and that. So I don't think that he would risk that image by not clinging on the seat. Coming back to the question of if this would bring democratization to the country, I don't expect it to happen, like right away, because we're talking about a 20-year period where, like most of the rights and freedoms have been undermined. And also one thing to like keep in mind is that this is a very fractionalized party environment, and we don't know how this new dynamics are going to play out, right? We don't know if Hüdapar, when they're in parliament, are going to stick together with the AKP, or maybe, like they're going to form a different coalition with the new Refah party. We don't know what's going to be the, like playing field of the smaller center-right or Islamist parties from the opposition side. So I think it's kind of like a very muddy area right now. I would expect some restoring of like maybe basic stuff like rule of law, at least attempts to do so, but like real democratization, it would take a lot of time and a lot of build.
Great. So I think we have another good 15 minutes, which I'm delighted about. And I have so many questions of my own that I would love to hear your thoughts on. But I also want to invite you, if you have questions for one another. But on my own end, and this kind of reiterates a version of my earlier question, the strategy of alliance has been a very curious one on both sides, whether on the AKP's alliance or the opposition six-party alliance, or even the Labour Party and Green Left Party alliance, like across the board. And now even we see the Ümit Özdağ, Sinan Oğan alliance itself coming into play. So you just have, on the one hand, a fractured political spectrum, as we've said. On the other hand, these collections that have been put together in a kind of electoral, as an electoral strategy. And one question I have, and this is really what I was getting at with the, what do we expect after Monday for the political spectrum, is one way to read our outcome is the AKP has lost a substantial, I mean, this is its worst performance since 2002 at the parliamentary level. There's no doubt about that. Of course, another way to read it is there's a supermajority on the right in the parliament today, thanks to the opposition's own strategies, thanks to loss of MP positions for the Green Left Party, thanks to the CHP giving up, MP positions on its own lists, and thanks to the AKP itself bringing in Hüdapar, Refah, et cetera, in their alliance. So it's a really complicated map in some ways, but it's a map, I mean, for someone like me who has the prejudice of being interested in constitutionalism, as an example, it is a scenario in which one could imagine so-called opposition actors joining in a tactical supermajority to allow constitutional change through the parliament. And of course, in that case, it really depends enormously who the president is. None of them would support a Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu initiated constitutional change, which means that one of the core opposition platforms, return to a parliamentary system, is foreclosed today. No matter what happens on Sunday, that's simply not a possibility because there isn't a parliamentary bloc to support it. On the other hand, a platform that didn't exist, let's write a new constitution on the part of the AKP, suddenly has come into focus as a meaningful possibility. So I just wonder what, how we think about these blocs dissolving and what, both the best case scenarios and worst case scenarios for the next 5 years might look like, apart from the presidential, like putting aside just the presidential and looking at a more kind of retail politics level, what this parliament reflects, because given the very high electoral turnout, given the number of parties that for the first time, you're not necessarily wasting your vote by voting for these very small parties, because this alliance system has made it possible to, put aside the electoral threshold, which itself was lowered. I mean, all these dynamics have given us this makeup of parliament. And I just wonder how each of you thinks about that and thinks about what it tells us about going forward. I mean, even in a post-AKP world, what does this map tell us about the Turkish electorate if we were to be in a post-AKP world? In any order, anyone who's interested in answering this, or if you have your own question that you'd like to pose or comment that you'd like to make that you haven't had a chance to make. Utku, go ahead.
Just a brief comment about constitution and about the current government system that we have in Turkey. For our audience, let's remind ourselves that this new system basically was ratified in 2017. So this is a new system. Before that, Turkey had a parliamentarian system. Now it's a presidential system. I believe all of the major political actors in party politics, basically both the presidential system before the election. And each one of these, these actors had their own reasons. For instance, AKP basically representatives thought that they would just, keep the power in their hands. The CHP, the main opposition party, believed that it could basically mobilize all of the other list actors in opposition according to its own will within the system. Even I believe the Kurdish, this pro-Kurdish, like HDP or YSP right now, basically bought the system at some level because they believe that they could play the role of the kingmaker, within the system. So that's why, I mean, until this election, basically, even though most of the actors in the opposition seem to pretend to just, work for some sort of a systemic change back to the presidential, parliamentarian system, I don't think they were honest about their position. They did not have an honest position. So, but now, for instance, given they have these results, and let's see what's going to happen, this weekend. I think some of the actors in the opposition may change their position and really this time truly, may work, to just, facilitate some sort of a constitutional change in Turkish politics. Thank you.
I think another question that has been broadly engaged with internationally is what these elections portend for Turkey's role in its various regions, whether the Caucasus or the Middle East or Europe or NATO, or with respect to the war in Ukraine, etc. We haven't touched on that at all. I find it, I mean, the reason we haven't touched on it is I did not orient us to touch on it. But if any of you wanted to speak on that topic, and Evren, I saw your hand, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I was going to mention that about the recent and obvious support of Russia to Erdogan is very critical. So again, when the other candidate of the presidential elections, Sinan Oğan, decided to withdraw decided to support Erdogan in the second tour, there have been a lot of comments, and I'm not saying rumors, but comments and actual statements by some of the politicians, which have clearly indicated that Sinan Oğan has received a call from Azerbaijan's President Aliyev due to his close ties with the Azerbaijani oil companies and his investments in Azerbaijan, etc. So this pretty much shows us that if Erdogan wins, regardless of Sinan Oğan's position, Erdogan will continue and accelerate his rhetoric of using West and the Western countries as, potential enemies of Turkey, building up better relations with Russia, because after the 2016 coup attempt, Erdogan has filled the people around him, especially in regarding the consultancy for strategic decisions area, with people who are considered as Eurasianists, like they want to focus on collaboration with China and Russia, cut off the ties to the minimum level, possible minimum level with West and the European Union. And I believe in that scenario, not the NATO membership, but Turkey's ties with West will be reduced at minimum levels possible if Erdogan wins the elections. Just a comment. Thank you.
I know that Nihat, you also raised your hand, and I'll call on you in a minute, but I wanted to also note that Professor Bedirhanoglu suggested that maybe there's some possibility that given the economic crisis, the need for investment, there'll be some degree of liberalization in economic policy. And I want to, as a counter, potentially offer an alternative scenario in which the point that you just made, Professor Altinkas, about Putin's support was, we don't know, or at least I don't know, the actual amount of foreign currency that was made available directly by transfers to the central bank from Russia, but we know that there was a substantial transfer made in December 2022, January 2023. We do know the size of the transfers that were made from the Gulf countries, and they are on the order of 5 billion from the UAE, and I think equally large sum from Saudi. So here we're seeing a kind of authoritarian pact of sort of economic support, at least, in order to fill the vacuum that's been left by foreign investors that are extremely skittish about the strategies, perhaps electorally brilliant strategies per Professor Balaban, of allowing massive inflation, low interest rates in order to pursue high employment. That might be a winning electoral strategy, but it's a losing strategy from a foreign investment perspective, unless you can get other countries to just make direct transfers to your central bank. And so that's another element of, what has kept the lira afloat at the rates at its, even though it's lost some 500% of its value, it nonetheless is currently artificially high, the lira, and that, that depends upon these authoritarian relationships. But anyway, Professor Celik.
Actually, I want to continue first with the Russian support to Erdogan. The opposition communicated to the public that the some Russian groups and experts are involved in producing deepfake videos. And I think by mentioning this, the opposition preempted and prevented the spread of a lot more manufactured videos on the web. Of course, this authoritarian pact or increasing relations with Russia, deepening relations with Russia will continue. And I think if there are newer sanctions on Russia with regard to its invasion in Ukraine, Turkey would be less willing to participate. But when it comes to attracting hot money, as we call in Turkish, the capital, and also foreign direct investment, if we expect foreign direct investment to come to Turkey, we have to set up the rule of law first, because investors would like to see their facilities, protected against any sort of abuse. And also, it requires to increase the purchasing power of the Turkish people. That's why about 8 years ago, Honda, for example, the car manufacturer, closed down its production plant in Turkey because the cars became unaffordable for most Turkish people. So it would be difficult to fool foreign investors, especially from the Western world, with a brief-lived spring in Turkish politics following the elections. No, they will want to see, before having larger investments in the Turkish economy, they will want to see more progress in the field of democracy and rule of law. But of course, the flow of money from autocratic countries like Russia will continue. Thank you.
No, thank you. Professor Bedirhanoglu, were you going to speak? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I can just say something more about the global perception of Erdogan if he is to be elected again. It's just I don't think like the global powers, especially the United States and the European Union, are extremely unhappy with Erdogan. Of course, they're not very happy with the fact that Turkey is sliding more to the authoritarian side and whatnot. But there are a lot of things that they could have asserted more pressure on Erdogan, and they didn't. Like just right now, the Mahmur refugee camp is under siege by the Iraqi government, and then Turkey is supporting her with Turkey's support, and then we haven't heard anything internationally here. Turkey's attack on Rojava in the Kurdish regions in Syria, did Erdogan face any repercussions? Like, he's been waging a war there for years now. There hasn't been any repercussions. So there are all these areas that the West, the democratic Western countries, or whatever we want to call them, they are appeasing Erdogan. Like whatever he does in these fields, because of course we know that like the whole refugee crisis in Europe is happy with the trade-off with Erdogan, that like refugees can be kept in Turkey. So it's just the comment I made earlier about liberalization is also, I also would like to add that it depends on the percentage of votes if he is to be elected, right? If he wins with a on the lower 50%, it's gonna be different from like a landslide victory. So it's just, I also meant like the brief period of the realization that I think could come will not apply to the Kurds in Turkey. It's gonna be like, just as I said, to keep the system like a competitive authoritarian, it could again be like, oh, okay, let's now focus on the next election cycle. In this elections, we kind of depreciated his power a little bit. So in the next cycle, maybe, we could have better organization. Like this kind of narrative could dominate the opposition party. But then for Kurds, as I said, it's going to be another matter of survival in the country. The amount of pressure, the repercussions activists face is not comparable with the rest of the country. So
yes, and I think it's worth noting the numbers that have been detained and arrested in between these two rounds of election, specifically amongst Kurdish political activists. It's a sobering fact. Well, this has been a really remarkably rich conversation with many different perspectives, which is the thing that I find most valuable about a panel in which we have scholars that are focusing on different aspects of the Turkish political system, reflecting in real time, right? None of us has a crystal ball, but we're trying to engage in meaningful and real-time analysis of how best to read this political outcome as we then anticipate this last runoff. And then we have almost immediately, and this speaks again to Professor Bedirhanoglu's last comments, that we're in this perpetual idea that the way that we can still participate is at the margins in electoral competition. And so I'm almost confident that within a few weeks, we'll be thinking about the municipal elections and asking ourselves what this means for Ekrem İmamoğlu, what does it mean for Mansur Yavaş, what does it mean for the opposition, and so on. So it's like, and the fact that that question can still be asked in some ways also suggest an answer to, can we still speak of competitive authoritarianism even in the next round? We'll see. We'll see if people are indeed engaging in this kind of back and forth about municipal elections in the next 9 months or not. But perhaps we'll just all have to reconvene to analyze where we stand after Monday and where we stand as we think looking forward into the next 5 years once the dust has settled on the 2023 elections. In the meantime, thank you all so much for agreeing to join us to provide this, commentary in the interlude between rounds. It's been incredibly illuminating for me and just refreshing to hear a really deep dive analysis. So I really thank you very much for having joined us, and thank you to the audience.